tackle, you've got a whole other issue to deal with. So the next question we have to get to is what happens when something goes wrong? What's this regulatory process look like? So as far as regulatory action goes, the general process here is that it'll work through an escalating response. That's generally the approach that the FSIS will take. They'll start with some sort of notification of noncompliance in the form of a noncompliance record, or NR. NRs are part of doing business. That's really what it boils down to. That's a written memo that tells you that something needs to be paid attention to. Now, if multiple noncompliances have occurred, then in that case, the DVMS may recommend a notice of intended enforcement be passed along. Sometimes that second step is skipped if it's a severe issue. Like if an event was considered to be egregious in nature, then a suspension notice may be issued. In both cases, both an NOIE and a suspension notice are going to stop production for some period of time. The NOIE is something that can typically be quickly resolved, and then we can go back to production again. We just have to make sure we lay out a very clear corrective action before we continue. The suspension notice takes more time, because that needs to be passed to the district office for approval, and then you're able to start things back up again. So this is the general process that happens. Things will escalate from the NR to the NOIE to the suspension notice. So I've talked about this word egregious. The FSIS has actually done a nice job of defining what egregious is. That came in that document I told you guys about earlier. It's part of your books. Directive 6900.2 revision 2. So in there, you can see the list of things that the FSIS considers to be egregious. Now, this does not include all situations, but these 9 things give you examples of cases that are considered egregious. In essence, if something's considered an egregious act of abuse, it's typically a case where somebody did something meaningfully, that there was some sort of willful intent, or it's a case where they were aware that there was a problem and did nothing to fix it. So some of these things that are included here are like making cuts or skinning conscious animals. Of course, the religious slaughter exemption is going to come into play here. So if religious slaughter is being performed, or ritual slaughter is being performed, of course that cut is going to be allowed. Excessive beating or prodding of ambulatory or non-ambulatory disabled animals. This is an issue we run into too. For the most part, when it comes to non-ambulatory animals, if we're going to use an electric prod on them to help them to rise or get them to rise, you can't just continue to hold that electric prod on them until they finally stand. But it's usually a case where you get 1 or 2 touches. And if that animal's not responding, you either let the animal continue to rest, or you're going to have to euthanize. Once you reach the point of vocalization, that's the point where you definitely should not be applying the electric prod again. That's one thing I've seen in the past, is where somebody would try to get up a down cow, for example, and they place the electric prod on the animal and just hold it on there until the animal starts to bellow. And then they might stop for a second and then come back and hit them again, and they start bellowing again. At that point, you really need to stop. You should have stopped before you lay it back on the animal again. Let's see. The one that I really want to point out here is number 6, though, because this is actually our most common issue that we grapple with Humane Slaughter Act compliance. Multiple attempts, especially in the absence of immediate corrective measures, to stun an animal versus a single blow or shot that renders an animal easily unconscious. So what this is saying is that if we have to take multiple attempts to stun that are not effective and we're not doing anything to try to resolve the issue, that would be considered an egregious case. That will result in a suspension notice immediately. So we've identified what's considered to be wrong, what's considered to be egregious. The next question is there a way to avoid suspension if something does go wrong? The answer to that is not that clear. The clearest answer I can give you is maybe. In Directive 6900.2 Revision 2, that document that I included for you guys, that I encourage you to take a look at if you're a slaughter establishment, FSIS recommended the development of a systematic approach to animal welfare. The systematic approach is a HACCP program that's focused on animal welfare. Now, when it boils down to it, this is something that's actually not that difficult to lay out. We've built a few of these programs at UWRF. From time to time, we go out and we do installations at slaughter facilities, and it's usually a pretty fun thing for our students. They get out in the field, they get to do some training and things like that. But the way we do this is we identify we essentially have to identify what our critical control points are going to be. So what's going to get a plant in trouble? And then once we do that, we can start to lay out our program to identify how we're going to track performance. So the way that a systematic approach can help to prevent suspension, and a lot of you guys know this, is that one of the major principles of HACCP is record keeping. We have to keep records. And so what this does is it develops a bit of a track record. We have a history available to us. So the way that this helps is that if we have a history, a clear documentation of history where whatever event happened that caused us to get an NOI, if we have a record that shows that that has never happened before, if it's some sort of strange anomaly, then this is going to help you to receive the benefit of the doubt from your regulator. If you have no previous record, but you're just puffing out your chest and saying, look, this has never happened before, I don't know why you're doing this to me. It's your word against theirs, and your word will lose. It's as simple as that. But if you have records, then you have something you can stand on. And so this approach of using a systematic approach to animal welfare has actually become very, very common in federally inspected slaughter facilities. Nearly every major beef and pork slaughter facility in the U.S. is carrying a systematic approach to animal welfare now. Not a lot of small plants are using them yet, but it is an option, and they're not that hard to lay out and operate. So you follow the same steps as developing a HACCP plan with this, which means you're going to start your whole process out by listing out how your pre-slaughter handling and stunning process works. So you identify the steps, the unloading, handling, the stunning process. In each step of the process, you consider what can go wrong. The things that can go wrong that would result in you getting a suspension notice, those are the places where you're going to have critical control points. There are really three main CCPs that I typically write into the first version of a systematic approach to animal welfare for a slaughter facility, and they're listed here. Water availability in the pens, stunning efficacy. So when I talk about stunning efficacy, what I'm talking about is the percent of animals that have an effective stun on the first application of the stunner. That's what we're looking for. And bleed rail insensibility. You build those three things into your program as your three critical control points. Most everything else related to animal handling can actually be put in as good handling practices. Things that you would just generally train your employees to do all the time. You expect it to be done that way all the time. If you want to take a closer look at how to lay out one of these systematic approaches, you can see the Farm to Plate article in the back of your materials called Take a Systematic Approach. In that article, I lay out more clearly how to design one of these programs. And if you want more information, just reach out and get in touch with me. Send me an email, and I'm more than happy to send you templates that we have. So, here's the thing, though, about the systematic approach to animal welfare, and it's really the same thing with HACCP. So, when the Mega Reg came out in 1999, or actually 1996, and when people started to, or when the state inspected facilities started to have to comply with that regulation, started to have to install HACCP plans in the late 90s and early 2000s, one of the approaches that a lot of people took was that they built this program, they snapped it in a binder and said, whew, I'm glad that's over. And then they went back to whatever they were doing and let the binders collect dust. Here's the issue, is that if you do that with a systematic approach to animal welfare, if you don't continue to monitor and keep records and do reassessments on an annual basis, then when your plant has received a suspension notice, that program is not going to help you. Not at all. It kind of needs to be part, it actually has to be part of what you do. Just like HACCP has to be part of what you do. So if you take that approach, this type of system can actually be very, very useful. So let's go back to those approved stunning methods for a second. So remember, we've got three options available there. There are other options that can potentially be used. However, they have to receive a letter of no objection from the USDA. Generally speaking, we're dealing in particular with these two categories here. in most small and very small plants, and so this is where I'm going to focus the rest of my attention for humane stunning. So you won't see any more discussion of chemical stunning, simply because it's not a very common thing for small facilities. So as far as captive bolt and firearm stunning goes, the shot placement in general for the captive bolt and firearm is the same. We have a few options as far as where we can place shots, and a lot of it depends, especially in bovine animals, on if that animal is going to receive testing for bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease. If that's the case, the pole stun is not an option. However, if it's a younger animal, we could potentially stun behind the pole. I'm not recommending that that's your first option, but it is a potential option. I know some plants that actually use that very, very often. Now, the thing to remember is that we have to take very special care when we're dealing with firearms to reduce the risk of missed shots and ricochets. In 2014, we saw that about 36%, so a little more than a third, of FSIS enforcement actions with regard to humane handling were the result of ineffective firearm stunning. So we saw a total of 42 enforcement actions that were taken with regard to stunning in general, and 15 of those were focused on ineffective firearm stunning. So in most cases, in those reports, it included accounts of multiple shots being taken, with the first shot, of course, not being effective. We also saw that about 43% of enforcement actions in 2014 were due to ineffective captive bolt stunning, taking multiple shots to render an animal unconscious. So this is the majority of our enforcement action issue. It's captive bolt and firearm stunning. With that said, if you give me a choice on what stunning method I would use for any species, it's a captive bolt gun and a firearm. Hands down. Because I know that they're instantly effective. So the issue we run into here actually there are two issues that we run into here. One is the equipment. Is it maintained and is it appropriate for the job? The second piece, training. Are the people who are operating those tools trained on appropriate placement of the tool or placement of the stun? If you get those two things under control, then mechanical stunning, captive bolt and firearm, become really, really reliable very, very quickly. Now, as far as shot placement goes, when we're using a firearm or a captive bolt device, it's different between species. One thing I will tell you, and I'm pretty sure that everybody in this room probably already knows this, is that right between the eyes is never an option. Sometimes you'll hear people say that. I usually run into this most often with farmers when I'm trying to teach them how to euthanize animals with a firearm. And if I ask the question, where should you shoot the animal, they'll say, well, it's just between the eyes, right? I would like to meet whoever came up with this between the eyes thing and tell them to just shut it. Because that was not good advice. That's never good advice. So in all cases, the brain is located in domestic animals above the eyes. That means our shot placement has got to be above the eyes in some way, shape, or form. The objective of effective stunning, whether it's with a firearm or a captive bolt gun, is to cause a lot of brain damage really, really fast. That's what we want to do. And so we need to make sure that we place our shot in a location that's going to cause a lot of brain damage. So this diagram is actually one of my favorites, just from a generalized sense, that it lays out shot placement for a variety of species. I'm going to go into more detail with swine and with cattle in particular. In the case of sheep and goats, we should be shooting for the top portion of the head if we're using like a captive bolt gun. Captive bolt guns work great for lambs and goats. But the placement of the shot should be in an X between the eye and the opposite ear. In the case of sheep, in the case of goats, it should be slightly behind that point. In the case of sheep, we fire directly down, straight down toward the throat of the animal. In the case of goats, we'll want to tip slightly forward. So we kind of aim for just in front of that 90-degree turn in the animal's jaw. Now, as far as shot placement goes, we're targeting the brain. In every case, we're targeting the brain. This picture in particular right here is actually one of my favorites from a training perspective. This is a picture that I took about 10 years ago because I wanted to know exactly where the brain was located in the skull of a bovine, and I could not find any materials that could help me to show that. I mean, I was digging through anatomy and physiology books. I couldn't find anything that gave me as clear a picture as what I really, really wanted. And to be honest with you, for a lot of, at least for me, and I'm sure for a lot of you in this room, you're told where to place a stun, but whatever's inside that animal's head is kind of a black box. So the way to get around that is to split heads. So most plants have a bandsaw, and so what you should be doing is splitting heads, especially when you're training somebody to stun. One of the best things you can possibly do is show them where they should place the shot with a head that's been split on your bandsaw. So they can see exactly where that brain is located and exactly where they're aiming for. Then you can continue to check performance from time to time. If you get done with kill a little early one day, save a couple of heads back that you could split when you're breaking carcasses the next day. Then you can check and you can make sure that you're actually placing your shots in the right location. One thing to keep in mind though is that when you're going to split heads, always make sure that you cut the animal's snout off, like the tip of the nose, before you run that thing down the bandsaw. Does anybody know what teeth do to bandsaw blades?
Sparks.
Sparks. And when there are sparks on a bandsaw blade, that means your bandsaw blade is not going to be very good anymore. As a matter of fact, when we were prepping some of the heads for some of these pictures, I ended up buying a bandsaw blade for my new lab manager. That's all right though. It's just sharp enough yet that I can continue to split heads, but I tell you, I would not cut T-bones with that thing. So anyway, if you're dealing with cattle heads, you can actually feel that there's a smooth place in their jaw where there are no teeth right here. And oftentimes we'll actually use that as a handle when we're carrying that head around on the kill floor. Cut the whole snout off right there. And then you can run that down your bandsaw. And to split that head, you want to flip it so the frontal plate of the skull is against the table of the bandsaw, because that gives you a stable surface to work with. Start with the nose first, and you should be steering that head through your bandsaw so that you're aiming for the entrance point of the spinal cord at the back of the skull. That's a really nice sort of way to get a good alignment so that you can see exactly right down the center of that brain. Now, when we're stunning, the place where we're targeting, folks, is actually not just anywhere in this space. We really want our bolt